I'm Alan Grostephan. I'm a novelist, author of The Banana Wars, Bogota, and I'm also the translator of Stories of Life and Death, Historias de Vida y Muerte, and I'm a professor at Agnes Scott College. So I think the way I got interested in the historical moment of the novel, of The Banana Wars, is when I was living in Bogota in the late 90s, early 2000s. I met a number of people who were from Urabá and had grown up and come of age during the so-called Banana Wars. And so these are people who lived through the sort of the stage of guerrillas, when guerrillas were controlling the plantations. And then they lived through the second stage, which was even more violent, was when the planters sent in paramilitaries to retake the banana zone and to seek out and kill and cleanse the population of anybody who smelled like a guerrilla or looked like a guerrilla or might possibly be collaborating with the guerrillas. And those are just sort of stories I would hear. And when I lived in Bogota, I'd never been to Urabá. So in the 3 years I lived in Bogota, that was it. It was just sort of a rumor. And then time passed, many years passed, maybe 18 years almost. And I kept thinking a little bit about bananas. And I was thinking about the business of bananas and the connection between an American consumer and a history of violence. So in 2018, I traveled to Urabá for the first time. I had a whole list of contacts and people to talk to. I went to a couple banana plantations, walked the fields with managers, with workers, and gradually people started to open up and tell me stories. So the story behind Bogota is that for the years I was living there, I was doing work teaching theater workshops and creative writing workshops in essentially a shanty town or a slum outside the city named Casuca. And most of the people living there had escaped violence. They were displaced from all over the country. And the place they got to, not quite all the way to Bogota, they were an hour out of the city, was also a place of violence. And so they escaped, let's say, paramilitaries, and then they got to a neighborhood where paramilitaries also existed, just the urban version of them. And so that work I was doing, violence was a big part of it. The writers I was working with were writing about violence, particularly the social cleansing, when paramilitaries would come into the neighborhood at night and they would kill anybody they considered a thief or a junkie, or often teachers or anybody considered sort of left wing or in any way, doing some kind of grassroots organization or something like that. Anyway, but the years passed and I went back there because I stayed connected with a nonprofit there. And I met a guy who had just recently been used by paramilitaries. He was a boatman, and had to take them up a river. This is in like way far from Bogota, northern Colombia. And these paramilitaries carried out a massacre of teenagers in another town. And then he went back to his town, and the people in his town accused him of being a paramilitary, tied him to a tree, and were going to kill him. And then him and his son, he and his oldest son got tied to a tree and were going to be killed. And then the local priest intervened, saved their lives, got them out of there. But he lost his boat, lost his home, lost whatever, his business, his community, and was standing there in front of me in Bogota telling me this story, right? This story of violence. And to me, then what do, right? Like, as a fiction writer, as a journalist, how do you respond to a story like that? Maybe you don't do anything, right? So I went back to Bogota, I remember that day, and I was talking to friends of mine, Colombians, and I said, man, I heard this really sad and just unsettling story in Casuca today. And I feel like in general, and this is just having so many years of civil war, my Colombian friends are like, whatever, like this is a story, it's been on the news, it's in the movies, right? And we've heard it so many times, right? That it is very sad. So I thought, well, the only way then to like give it sort of a body, right? To give it some variation, right? To give it significance is to write it, right? You have to sort of look at the particularity of the story, recreate that story, and invent it, right? So this is sort of the impetus for the book. was that story, which actually does end up beginning the book. But the way Bogota began was a very different story, right? That, you know, happens much later in the book. But and that also comes out of sort of a story of violence, which is a robbery in the neighborhood that I had heard a story about. Anyway, I don't know, like this last year, I've been thinking in some ways about like novels that write violence, right? Like Bolaño's 2666, Chile by Night, Distant Star, right? The latter of those two are both about the Chilean dictatorship, and in all those cases, people being tortured and murdered. 2666 is about the murder of women who are poor, or sex workers, or factory workers, and a fictional Ciudad Juarez. And then this year, I started the year, I read Lily Tuck's The Rest is Memory, which is about the Holocaust, which is brilliant, it just came out. And I read Scholastic's Mukasonga's two books about the Rwandan massacre. So Sister Deborah and Cockroaches, which is a memoir about her, you know, I think half her family was murdered in the Rwandan genocide. And so I think partly I'm interested in sort of what causes violence, and then how do people go on living with it, right? How do you turn it into some kind of a story? What does it do to a culture? What does it do to a community? What happens in terms of language? And so I think for whatever reason, I couldn't say why, I've been interested in these stories, and then how, you know, I think literature is capable of it too. Some people think, oh, you can't translate violence to the screen, you can't translate violence to fiction, but of course you can, right? I mean, there's some very violent masterpieces like Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. It's the most violent book I've ever read, and it's great. Mm-hmm. Well, the thing you don't want to do is sensationalize it. I mean, there's no colder depiction of violence than Bolaño's descriptions of bodies. You know, 2666 is all autopsy reports. Mm-hmm. And they're redundant, they're boring at some point, but they're super particular. So every single woman's body that is found in the desert or on the streets of Santa Teresita, usually they've been raped, and they've been killed in different ways, in brutal ways. They've been strangled. They're battered, right? It's not they don't just have bullet holes in their head, but it's cold. I think that's how you write violence, right? I mean, you don't need to ever overdo it. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, in some ways this starts, the influence of Latin American writers for me begins when I'm an undergraduate, and I took a course in translation. I read the Latin American boom writers. I read Fuentes, Carlos Fuentes, I read Borges, I read Cortázar, all the poets, Octavio Paz, Pablo Neruda, Gabriel Mistral, Alejo Carpentier, right? So all these sort of big names, right, that have, you know, done all these things. And one of the things I loved about those writers was that they broke all these taboos, right? They were unafraid to write about sex, sexual transgression. They were writing about violence. They were writing critically of the ruling classes, right? These sort of historic, kind of feudal landowners in Latin America. They were unafraid to write critically about the Catholic Church. So all that, I mean, these very audacious novels, and then they were totally unafraid to reinvent the novel, right? To reinvent what fiction can do. You know, there obviously a lot of that comes from European modernism and American modernism, and Faulkner and Joyce and Woolf and all those influences. And then from there, I end up in Chile, right, where my relationship with the literature ceases to be one in translation, and I'm reading in Spanish, those very same writers, and then a lot of new ones. And I fell in with a group of poets in Chile later called La Novísima Generación, which is this 21st century group of Chilean poets who break all the rules that nobody was breaking during the dictatorship in Chile, the Pinochet dictatorship. And then in the 90s generation of Chilean poets was very safe. They wanted to write things about, you know, beautiful things, and maybe they were still scarred from censorship, right? But then this group comes along and they're writing about sexuality, they're writing about, you know, Chilean society in these very critical ways, they're writing about violence, just, you know, kind of stories of the street and young people organizing. And that to me was like, okay, that's what literature is, right? You have to provoke, you have to break rules, and you can do anything you want, right? That you don't have to dress up with a tie and a suit coat and write these sort of nice letters, right? You don't have to be part of this canon. You don't have to respect their tradition necessarily. You can totally write against their tradition, the literary canon. And so one of the things I loved about that group is they would get attacked all the time. People would come to readings and tell them that they were disrespectful, that they were not paying homage to this sort of Chilean tradition or Latin American tradition, that they needed to whatever, write sonnets, right? That they needed to sort of write in certain forms, and they were completely irreverent. So anyway, I think that's what I get out of Latin America is just the writers to me are they take risks, and I think they're also unafraid to write about subjects that are really hard to write about, right? I mean, they'll go anywhere. Yeah, I mean, to me, the relationship between creative writing and AI it's strange because one of the things that's happened to every writer I know is that our books got fed to AI so AI can recreate us, right? That both my novels have been fed into AI. I mean, I'm part of a class action suit with every other writer whose book went to OpenAI. And you can ask AI to write like me. Just say, write in the style of Alan Grostephan. And what AI gives you, of course, is not me, right? And my feeling is that what makes good writing is nuance, it's subtlety, it's particularity, and it comes from the quality of mind of the writer. And AI just does not have a quality of mind. I don't think you can create it. It doesn't have a soul, right? So every artist, writer, musician, you know, just filmmaker, I think every good one anyway, I think you could make, hacks. AI can be a great hack. Could write a detective novel, a hack one. Could make sort of a standard, whatever, rom-com, romantic comedy or something like that. But it's definitely not going to create a masterpiece. It's not going to create anything that would, last through time, that would really leave much of a residue in any kind of a reader. At least that I've seen. The students that have, my students who have tried to write with AI have written, it's their worst work ever, and I had a student fake a piece on, that they said they wrote that was AI, and I could tell it was AI for all these reasons, right? For the headings and just the diluted sort of soulless style. And when I gave it to the workshop, I said, let's critique it. And this thing got destroyed, right? So my student was not getting workshopped, the AI was. We were essentially critiquing software to tell the software it was a bad writer. AI can do technical writing, AI can make websites, AI can process tons of data. All that, forget about it. That's all going to exist. I'm not against it either. I mean, there's no point in being against it. It's coming. But I don't think it replaces art or literature. Yeah, that's my feeling. Yeah, I think it's always been complicated in that as a teacher, as a professor of creative writing, and I've been one now for quite some years, right? Maybe almost 15 years, 13 years. Is people have asked me, "Oh, are your students all going to go on and publish books?" And that's not true. A portion of them will, right? Not everybody who takes a creative writing course or majors in English and creative writing is a writer, right? That's just not how it works. Not everybody wants to devote themselves to it. Not everybody's going to read their whole life, or at least read in that way. My feeling is that students who study creative writing with me, that they walk out of that class and they know more about what writing can do. They know what language can do. They have more control over their language. They have more tools that they can use to tell stories, to perceive the world, right? To sort of translate kind of where they stand in their lives and in the world, right? That, yeah, they get sort of that out of the reading, out of the discussion, out of just some of the technical things that you learn in a creative writing course. And in that way, they become better storytellers. They become better self-advocates. They become more powerful, I think, just with language. Because there's no doubt in my mind that, your work as a writer and your ability to use language, to craft language, to tell stories, to use rhetoric is a form of power. right, in a form of empowerment. So that's my hope. Like anybody who comes through a creative writing class comes out of there with like something, right, to sort of defend themselves and survive in the world.